Okay, we're live. Hi, this is William Ramsey. Welcome to William Ramsey Investigates. On today's show, I have a very special guest, a returning guest. His name is David Livingstone. We talked 2 times in the past. One was about really a fascinating, an excellent book, 6-part book titled Ordo ab Chaos. And I'll put a link in the show notes to that book. That's the dictum of the Masonic orders, Order out of Chaos, Latin version. And it's a very detailed book, tons of research, really a magnum opus. And we talked about that, the intro, that was our first interview. And then we talked about a subset within that book, which was kind of about the European fascism, things like that theme. But today I reached out to him. I keep coming across this book, Terrorism and the Illuminati. And I speed read through it. But the reason why it intrigued me is because I think that these secret societies and this false flag terror is still an issue today, 2022. Events that happen to facilitate political change or social change. So I think it's important. And this is another kind of sweeping book that is similar to Ordo ab Chaos, because he goes all the way back in time through different kind of ethnic groups, through certain groups, the assassin, Hashashin, all the way to the present day, things that people kind of know about. I learned stuff in this book I didn't know about Muhammad Atta, and he can kind of talk more about that. This isn't his first book. His first book was The Dying God, The Hidden History of Western Civilization. That was published 2002. Then this one, Terrorism and the Illuminati, A 3,000-Year History, 2007. Then Black Terror, White Soldiers, Islam, Fascism, and the New Age, 2013. Transhumanism, The History of a Dangerous Idea, excellent title, 2015. We're really in a dangerous time considering transhumanism, gender fluidity, or whatever. And then Ordo ab Chaos, which I think came out last year or the year before that. And I will, like I said before, I'll put the 6-part series in there. But we're going to talk about terrorism and the Illuminati. So David Livingstone, welcome back to the show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
You're definitely one of my most listened to guests. And when people found out you're coming back, definitely the most kind of excitement from my audience. So I'm delighted to have you back. I know this is one of your earlier books.
Yeah.
Can you kind of talk about your sensibility, why you're going back into this 3,000-year approach leading up to today, and what you kind of learned on the way, and just tell us about terrorism and the Illuminati.
Okay. So when I wrote The Dying God, I attempted to trace the history of the occult of Freemasonry back to its origins, and I traced it back to Babylon, from specifically to the 6th century BC. There was a lot of older traditions that kind of fed into it, but that's really when the Kabbalah was effectively born and then transformed into different trajectories that basically fed what's called the Western esoteric tradition. And so I thought, I really took my time to get right to the bottom of it. I thought I'd covered it pretty thoroughly. And I had no idea I was going to write any more books after that. But little by little, certain things started to add up. Principally, I discovered the Masonic origins of the Wahhabi movement of Saudi Arabia. So that was particularly fascinating. And then so as I started digging, just a whole lot of things started to connect back to the occult history that I've been finding. And I started finding new channels or parallel paths to a lot of the topics that I had been studying. So basically, why I call it 3,000-year history is because it's terrorism was largely, still is today. These days, it's right-wing terrorism, but of course, until recently, it was Islamic terrorism. And so terrorism has been a tool of the Illuminati, whatever you want to call them, most recently. And of course, the Illuminati is an organization that was founded in 1776, but is founded on an occult tradition and history that goes back, like I said, to at least ancient Babylon.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. So these occult orders are learning from past. They go all the way back to the inception of history, right? So you talk, they like to reference it. Babylon is probably that inception point. So can you talk about some of those ideas that came out of Babylon and work its way up to the present day?
Yeah, so basically it's effectively the history of Satanism. So what the problem is that, the modern perception isn't, when you look at books like, let's say, Dan Brown's Da Vinci Code, it's a it's a it's a promotional book for Satanism, and it doesn't, of course, it doesn't describe itself with that, but that's how, I think that people like Anton LaVey, when he founded the Church of Satan, it's basically a circus show, right? I mean, he's a former circus performer. It's really just it's theatrics, and it's nothing near what real Satanism is. And the problem is I think he contributed to a false perception of what Satanism is, and
like a caricature.
Yes, simplified Hollywood version of Satanism, right? And the problem is that real Satanism as well too is really misperceived as well. It tends to be sort of narrowed into black magic and ritualistic, without a lot of understanding of where a lot of the symbolism and the ideas come from. But when you look at the history of Satanism, it's actually quite large, and it encompasses a lot of different doctrines, elements, components that have a pretty wide history. So, in the history of Satan, so in the cult of Satanism as a whole, at the top of it, of course, is worship of Satan as the liberator of mankind. But there's an entire theosophy that goes with it, and that includes the astrology, the belief in, of course, alchemy, black magic, numerology. So all the components that would be involved in that, and then you have to basically hybrid that onto a reverse interpretation of the book of Revelation. So they're basically trying to bring about the fulfillment of Bible prophecy, except they see it in reverse, whereas they're trying to advance the triumph of Satan through the use of magic and all these things, which is why so much is timed with astrology and all these kinds of things. So to understand the origins of the occult, this is why it goes back to Babylon. And like I was starting to say, is that a lot of people, when they look at these cults, and this is how a lot of these modern occultists are trying to peddle it these days, is that they claim that these cults were misunderstood, particularly the ancient Gnostics. They were misunderstood. They were just, they were a radical Christian interpretation, which was mischaracterized by the Catholic Church, who wanted to suppress them because they feared the so-called truth. This is absurd. The cults, the practices that were adopted by the Gnostics were the same that were adopted by various pagan cults around the time. One in particular, there's a very famous incident that was publicized by an ancient Roman writer called Livy, and basically it caused such a scandal that the Roman government had to try to suppress these cults. So this is a pagan government suppressing a pagan cult. Obviously, can't be any prejudice there. And the impression is, of course, is that the devil is a concept that was invented supposedly by the Judeo-Christian tradition, but the reality is that the concept of good and evil is something you find in every culture, and some cultures have the worship of evil. And this is why in the ancient Middle East there was a particular cult, and this is why my book is called The Dying God, because I focus on identifying the origins of this dying God worship, because it was known, scholars refer to it as a chthonic cult. So basically, the dying God was typically worshipped as a god of the underworld. And so he was, if you go to Greece, another pagan culture, or other parts of the Middle East, which had like no association whatsoever with the Bible or Judeo-Christian tradition, they overtly identified these gods as underworld and evil gods.
Right. Poseidon, right?
Yeah, you look at basically Apollo, Dionysus. Those are female versions. So, of course, Athena, Aphrodite, they all have their equivalents in other parts of the world. So in Persia, you had, or Babylon, you had Bel or Marduk. That's where you get the worship of the Saturnalia, which is what I follow in order of Cal. The Mithra who was worshipped amongst the Persians, and that evolved into Mithras, which is basically the core, and that's what I really treat in Terrorism, Illuminati, because there's what I call the Mithraic bloodline, and it's this bloodline, this confluence of the families who were responsible for the formulation and preservation and development of the cult of Mithras seem to have been the families that survived into later times. But they're really the families that, because the Kabbalah begins in the 6th century BC, but it really flourishes in the 1st centuries AD. Particularly, I mean, at the forefront would be Mithraism, but all the other cults that contributed to it, like Neoplatonism and Hermeticism and the other mysteries. And that's why Plato is really very much the godfather of the Illuminati.
Wow. And how was that? How was this godfather?
So what happens is that so this is what I trace in the Dying God, and this is I think I've substantiated pretty well, and I think this is an aspect which is, in fact, the funny thing is that this would be exactly what Albert Pike would claim, except he's not regarded as a respected historian, but it just shows you that this history is acknowledged in the occult, because what you can see is that the Jews basically were captured by the Babylonians and are brought to Babylon. Babylon
It's right there at the time, right? 6 BC.
Yeah, they were there for 50 years, right? And so basically, this is how you get this confluence of all these ideas. So this is how you have these Israelites who, probably not all of them, but a certain group of them who had because the history before that of the Bible is the history of the Jews repeatedly worshiping the dying God, right? So Baal and Moloch and so on and so forth, sacrificing their children, worshiping the planets, the communing with spirits, the whole story.
Sex at the temples, like sexual, whatever, temple prostitutes, like really dark stuff. Yeah.
Exactly. So even the temple itself, so it's basically like the Vatican. If the Vatican had been turned into a pagan monument, that's effectively what happened to the Jewish community. They had basically, if there was any element of Judaism in them, I think it would have been very, very small. In fact, it was pretty much only reformers who were attempting to try to bring it back. Otherwise, the community as a whole was indistinguishable from any of the neighboring society.
Right. That's like the groundwork of all the tension in the Old Testament. A lot of it is just fighting against these pagan traditions that you're talking about.
Right.
Sorry, go ahead.
So the Babylonian captivity is a prophecy fulfilled, according to the Bible, right? If they didn't cease from worshiping these Baal and Astarte, they would be taken in captivity by their enemies, and that's specifically what happens in, I think, 597 BC. So they're taken to Babylon, and so what happens then is you get this merger, the confluence of basically the worship of Baal, which is the same as the Babylonian Bel, and mixed then with Babylonian magic and astrology. And it's been proven that the Babylonians had a very ancient tradition of astral elements in their religion, but the astrology itself was developed in the 6th century BC. So you can see all these elements come together. And what happens is that the Persians come in 538, 539. Cyrus comes along and he liberates the Jews and he allows them to return to Israel. So they go back to Israel, they rebuild the temple, So the problem is that this time the world was not aware of who the Jews were. The Herodotus, he described the people of Phoenicia as having been exiles from Egypt who practiced circumcision. So basically, he was calling the Jews Phoenicians, and this is when the cult of the Magi began to spread. So this cult that was a mix of the elements of astrology and dying god worship became attributed to the Magi. We don't have a lot of time. I hope I'm not getting too complicated.
No, you're doing great.
Good.
Take your time. We have I can give you a full hour.
Okay.
Past that.
All right. So the problem is that the Persian Empire was Zoroastrian. So they worship basically it was a religion founded by Zoroaster. It's not really well known when it was founded. There's various theories. Some of them take it all the way back to about 2000 BC, which doesn't necessarily make any sense. But anyway, there's no.
Freddie Mercury was a Zoroastrian. It's hard to believe, but that came out of Persia.
Yes,
he was part of the Persian diaspora and had a Zoroastrian funeral. So
Right.
it's still around. I think the Manichaean idea comes from Zoroaster, right?
Yeah. So that's the challenge, is that there's a real orthodox, genuine Zoroastrian tradition, which was really very much the religion of the Persian Empire. They worshipped. They had two gods. They had a good god, Ahura Mazda, and Ahriman, who was the evil god. And they believed they were basically in eternal conflict. So it was a completely separate religion, and it had a legitimate tradition in Persian civilization. What happened now is you have these magi who became famous throughout the Middle East, and the religion that they followed really had very, very little to do with Zoroaster, even though they attributed their cult to Zoroaster. So this is why most academics have got lost on this topic. And the founder of this study is Franz Cumont, and his co-author Joseph Bidez. And he wrote. So basically, he's considered the founder of the study of Mithraism. And I've said this many times, but in my estimation, he's the best scholar, the greatest scholar of the 20th century, at least Western academic. Because what's rare these days is for a single scholar to have a depth of expertise in many traditions. So you have a lot of scholars who are, very well educated, let's say specifically in Greek civilization, or might be in Middle Eastern civilization, but he had enough knowledge in most of the ancient civilizations to be able to see where the patterns were and where the cross influences were. So he's the one who identified that the Magi were not Zoroastrians, they were heretical Zoroastrians. Because there was a number of books that were circulating at the time that were attributed to Zoroaster, his student named Zosimus, and his sponsor Hystaspes. So various books were being circulated, and they all had to do with magic and astrology and numerology, attributed to Zoroaster. Of course, there was no way the original Zoroaster would have taught these doctrines. So the question is, where do they come from? So basically, they were developed in Babylon in the 6th century BC, and they were falsely attributed to Zoroaster. And this is where, for years to come, this remained confusion. So when the so-called Magi left Babylon, some of them arrived in Greece with the expansion of the Persian army, and many of them arrived in Egypt. So this is why when you look at the earliest accounts of Greek philosophy, they begin on the western coast of Turkey, not the peninsula, Greek peninsula itself, which was then part of the Persian Empire. And there's numerous accounts that claim that certain Greek philosophers had learned their teachings from the Magi, and there's specific accounts that claim that Pythagoras himself traveled to Babylon.
Wow.
I think Plato himself.
That's amazing. Yeah. I didn't know that. And Pythagoras, you probably know this, but he's really one of the foundations of Masonry and the Western occult tradition. He's just a very important figure. Absolutely. People know the Pythagorean theorem, but they thought he was like a magic man, could be at two places at the same time. Yeah. They attribute all kinds of spiritual power to
exactly. Him. So Plato effectively was sort of like like the chief successor of Pythagoras. And this is why, they've even found evidence that the cult of Mithras, or the cult of Dionysus that was practiced, basically a satanic cult, that was satanic mysteries that were being practiced in Greece at the time. In fact, it's Heraclitus, who lived in I think the 5th century BC, who claimed that the cult of Dionysus was adopted from the infernal rites, as he called it, of the Magi. And there's a papyrus that was discovered, which basically can be dated back to that period, which substantiates the claim. So clearly, this satanic Magian cult infiltrated Greece, and this is why it's clear, you can see in Plato's teachings that he basically was, and there was numerous people influenced by the Magi, people who were directly an Magian influence that were part of Plato's academy, who contributed basically to this background. And this is why he basically, particularly the Timaeus, which is there's two books that are really key to the occult tradition, that's Timaeus and the Phaedrus. And so Timaeus is basically an astrological book. He lays out his astrological doctrine. And Plato is the father of fascism. Right? So Plato is the one who envisioned the state to be ruled by the philosopher kings, as he called them, over there's basically three strata. So then there would be like the soldier class and then the plebes, right? What I won't go into this now, but what I look at in my book in Aroab Cow is that this, with Alexander the Great, this three-layered caste system was imported to India. And then that's why there you have this whole the importance of the symbolism and tradition of Alexander the Great and all the peoples who are descended from them. And this is something that's not a lot talked about, but it's particularly in Pakistan and Afghanistan. There's a lot of people who claim descent both from the lost tribes and as well as Alexander.
I didn't know that. That's amazing. Alexander made it that as far as the Indus, right? At least as far as the Indus. I think they crossed the Indus.
There's a whole portion. There's basically the what's it called, the Greco Indo-Greek empires that lasted for centuries, that were Greeks ruling portions of Pakistan, northern India, and Afghanistan for centuries. There's a whole,
and Egypt. Those of the offspring of Alexander's generals ruled Egypt through Rome, at least. Right. I don't know what.
But there's this whole sort of like mix of Greek and Buddhist culture which survived for centuries in that part of the world. Like the Greek influence there is not properly, adequately considered to understand the significance of that heritage. But that's another tangent.
So you're laying the groundwork for all the stuff that's leading up to today. So
exactly,
these scholars, and they all go back, and almost all the occultists I've come across, they want to trace their legacy back to Babylon. They all do. So the longer, like whatever document it is, if you can trace it to Babylon, it has the most legitimacy in the occult today.
Exactly. And like you said, Pythagoras and then Plato as well too. And the other tradition is Hermeticism. So Hermeticism is claimed as attributed to an ancient sage named Hermes, Egyptian sage named Hermes. And it's not known when or if ever he existed. But basically, it's another adaptation of the Magian cult to Egyptian mythology. It's basically the tradition that created the tradition of alchemy. So then, when Alexander conquered Egypt and he created the Alexandrian Empire, was what's called the birth of the Hellenistic age. Sorry, the city of Alexandria. You get this confluence of all these traditions. So you get a mix of you get the Magian influence, you get the Egyptian influence, you get the influence of Neoplatonism, and then because it's part of the Roman Empire, you get all this influence of various mystery cults. So the mysteries of Isis, the mysteries of Sybil. There's numerous mysteries. Of course, the most important one was the mysteries of Mithras. And the mysteries of Mithras has really confounded modern scholars. They think that Francis Kimel got it all wrong because they say, look, there had no relation to Zoroastrianism. But Francis Kimel will point out he never said it had anything to do with Zoroastrianism. That's the whole point. The whole point of his study was to prove that it's heretical Zoroastrianism. So this is why it's not being properly understood, and the significance of it has not been understood. So and what happens now is that you get the family. You get I always forget how to pronounce it. It's the Claudio Julia dynasty. It's the dynasty of about 5 emperors who were related to after Caesar, who claimed descent from Julia, one of the or Julia, it's Latin maybe, one of the survivors of the Trojan War, right? And what's interesting is that he's descended from Ascanius. And this now becomes really important. I trace it. It's surprising to me, but Ascanius is related to Ashkenaz. Okay? So, and this even claims substantiated by Josephus, an ancient Jewish historian as well too.
History of the Jews, history of the Roman War. Was it the Jewish War?
Yeah. So he thought that Dardanus was effectively descended from Judah, I think. So who after the Dardanelles are named after. So this Julia dynasty that claimed descent from the Trojan War, and specifically Ascanius, they basically used the Ennead, I think, as like a propaganda to sell their importance to the Roman Empire and the importance of their dynasty. And now they intermarried extensively with First of all, the priest kings of Emesa. Emesa is a city in Syria, which was the focal point of the worship of Elagabalus, which is it's basically a derivation of Baal.
Gotcha.
And so it's basically another variation of the same dying god cult. And so a lot of these priest kings of Emesa now were contributing to the development of, most of them were involved somehow in development of Neoplatonism, right? So again, to understand Western esoteric history, though the main paths to follow are Neoplatonism and Hermeticism, plus the mysteries. So that's why that's interesting. So you have the Julia Claudia dynasty, the priest kings of Emesa, and then you have the House of Herod. And this is really important. So Herod is a very peculiar case because he's not really Jewish. They are Edomites that converted to Judaism, and that has a whole history on itself, which I'm sure a few listeners will know what clue that refers to. And
well, the Edomites, right? Weren't they supposedly offspring of Lot and his daughters? The Moabites and the Edomites, I think, were descendants of escapees from Sodom and Gomorrah. At least I think that's the legend. I don't know.
Well, the thing with the Edomites is that they are, so when Jacob, I guess it was Israel, had two sons, Jacob and Esau, and Jacob's mother helped him fool the father into handing the birthright to Jacob instead of Esau, who was the legitimate son. And Esau was described as being ruddy or red-headed. So basically, Edom means red. And so ever since that time, Edom is considered to be really the origin of the red-haired aspect of the. And this is key because this is what leads us to Dan Brown, right? The red hair is supposed to be, Mary Magdalene had red hair, which is supposed to prove that she's part of this ancient Illuminati bloodline, or whatever you want to call it.
And just for people who don't know, there is a sequence of sex magic in Dan Brown's novel. So it's a very small scene, but there's definitely some kind of weird Middle Eastern sex magic thing that the guy was involved in.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's almost the focal point of the whole book is that the daughter, when she's young, she happens on her grandfather, who was her protector, in an act, participating in a sex rite. And of course, she's shocked. And only later can she supposedly learn that, it's misunderstood, but it's just actually, the true Christianity.
Right. Yeah, it's totally nonsense. I was wrong. The offspring of Lot were Moab and Ammon. So I apologize.
Right. Yeah.
Not Edom.
So, so that's why when you look at the red-haired heritage, we're not going to go into this tangent, but basically that's where it goes into the Khazars and the Scots and the people of actually Ukraine and that whole other history. But where were we? So
we're just kind of developing past like the Rome and all that stuff.
So all these families. So what's really interesting is that the House of Herod was forming all these dynastic alliances with the Roman empires and the priest kings of Emesa, and a lot of them were having to basically, to marry the daughters and the granddaughters of Herod, they had to convert to Judaism, and so there was a real conflict there, of course, with the practice of circumcision. So this is why it became a real contentious issue, and this is why. So Robert Eisenman, who is a pretty well-respected researcher on the Dead Sea Scrolls, he wrote an article, which is a short article, but it's a bombshell. He basically says that Saint Paul, was an agent of the House of Herod. So what's interesting, what people forget is that, Christians will apologize or will forgive me, but basically, the Gospels were revealed to Jesus. There's 4 of them having to do with the message of Jesus. The books of Paul, and who were direct disciples of Jesus, whereas Paul only claimed that he saw Jesus in a vision. So we have to take his word for it. But when you look at his teachings and how far they depart from the message in the other four gospels, you really have to wonder where he was going. So what I think in this book and several of my other ones is to show the influence, basically Paul's departure away from Christianity. So Jesus was effectively a Jewish reformer, there to try to bring the Jewish people back to what he believed was the truer tradition of Judaism. Paul brings in this entirely new doctrine, which effectively is very, very close to the Gnostic teachings. And there's several books, I can't remember, I'll be able to mention them off the top of my head, which basically exposes Paul as a Kabbalist. So why this is interesting is because these families now, this confluence of these families survive and become almost hereditary. So they become the hereditary leaders of the Roman Empire, as well as guardians of the Mithric tradition. And this is why their line of descent culminates in Constantine, who, of course, as is well known, establishes Christianity as their official religion of the Roman Empire. But the version of Christianity that he establishes is basically one that has been substantially modified to be as similar as possible to the Mithric tradition. And this is why, effectively, what I argue is that the version of Christianity which became adopted by the Roman Empire adopted the ideas like Jesus being the Son of God, being born on December 25th, which of course is the winter solstice, which is coincide with the birth of Mithras. The Eucharist is effectively, if I'm going to be blunt, I'm going to say it. It's a satanic ritual where you
transmogrification, right? Like,
yes, you eat
actual literal.
You eat the body of the god and you drink his blood, and then various other elements. I don't have to go into detail, but basically that's how these families really survived underground for centuries. So what's really interesting is that one of the leading, probably one of the most famous Neoplatonic philosophers is Iamblichus. And what's interesting about him is that he wrote one of the few books, which is probably one of the only surviving. I hope I'm getting that right. It's one of the only surviving literary elements in support of the religion of Mithras. And I think it's called The Triumph of the Nymphs or something like that. And see, on Pythagoras, it's Iamblichus who claims that Pythagoras had studied. He's one of the authors who claim Pythagoras studied in Babylon. So one of the descendants of Iamblichus is the grandfather of Charlemagne.
Wow, that's incredible.
Yeah, so I'm not sure, what significance that is, but it's a surprising clue. And then, so with Charlemagne, you have the birth of Europe. And so really, this is what I trace in my book. And I think this is where this Mithric bloodline becomes really interesting because what happens is that there's a book written called, I think it's called Sefer HaKabbalah, because there seems to have been, in fact, I'll backtrack again. His name is Arthur Zuckerman. So he's the one who wrote the book that provided a lot of the sort of the clue that sent the authors of the Holy Blood, Holy Grail on their path. Mm-hmm. It's called A Jewish Princedom in Septimania, I think is the book that he wrote. And so he claims that the Sefer HaKabbalah says that, so there's the story of this exarch. So at the time, the Jews were living in the Islamic Empire, and they had a ruler over their community called an exarch, who was basically claimed descent from David, and he was a hereditary ruler of the Jewish community. And there was a dispute. And so the disputant who lost the right to succeed to the office, he supposedly fled west. This is what the common, Jewish legend is. And so the story is that he ended up probably in France. And that's where he was accepted by Charlemagne and married his daughter or something like that. His sister, I can't remember what it was specifically. And So he's known as Rabbi Makir. And so this is basically, that's the core of where the Holy Grail takes off, is they believe that this kingdom, Jewish kingdom, in Septimania, kind of really gives birth to this Kabbalistic tradition, which becomes the Priory of Zion and all that stuff.
Wow, that's incredible. And my understanding is Charlemagne, like his bloodline has pervaded all of Western Europe. Have you heard that? That like he's like one of these kind of genetic.
We're all, if you have any European descent, you're related.
You're related to Charlemagne, yeah. So it's crazy. So this is the foundation. It does go into the Merovingians, goes into St. Clair. He talks about St. Clair in the book.
Yeah.
So this is the foundation of all this incredible 3,000-year history leading up to today.
It's the foundation of Masonic history. Yeah. So because the Rabbi Makir's son then supposedly is Guillaume of Gellon, who was one of the most famous heroes of the ancient sort of early, well, the chanson de geste, I think is what it would be called, like the sort of the various romances, and he becomes effectively, a hero linked to the legends of the Holy Grail. So what's fascinating is that what I've studied, and if you can follow it, is that all of these European bloodlines, the aristocratic bloodlines, they can all be traced back to Guillaume of Gellon. Because there's very past of them, but it's the ones in particular that are linked to him that serve effectively in preserving this occult tradition, particularly through the legends of the Holy Grail. And this is a subject I've studied even more carefully in my recent book, because I've been able to identify even more closely the specific people who are involved, like all the connections, all the authors, the various authors of the early Grail legends were specifically tied with the families, particularly the Plantagenets, and basically the French royal families.
Right. So it's all the Holy Grail is going through all of these elite traditions. It's totally reminds me of Eyes Wide Shut. Like Kubrick had keyed into this bloodline truth, which is why you see all those seals at the ritual room. All of those family, insignia and seals all hints at this tradition. And that's the real rulers. And they're involved in sex magic.
Yeah, it seems to be. So what's really curious is that what I found, again, and this is what I trace in I treat it in Terrorism, but I've investigated more deeply in my recent book, is that one of the founders of the Templar Order, his name was Hugh of Champagne. And Champagne is really fascinating, the Champagne region, because, it's amazing how a lot of these things can sort of, a lot of investigations can support each other. But there's a book called the Before Western Hegemony. And what she shows is that basically Western capitalism is born in the Champagne region. And the reason is because of the technologies that were brought back from the Crusades. And the leader of that community at the time was Hugh of Champagne. And Hugh of Champagne was one of the founders of the Templars.
Wow, fascinating. So it says here it was his third time to go to the Holy Land. So they're traveling that route to the Holy Land to fight, right?
Yes. So Hugh of Champagne was in contact with Rashi of Troy. And Rashi is probably the most important medieval Jewish scholar, like hugely famous. And so he was headquartered at Troyes, which is big. Troy, which was there is him, and which is was it in the Champagne region, I think. And so what's interesting is that Rashi,
it's in Champagne. Yeah, Champagne.
Yeah. So Rashi is also considered basically one of the earliest founders of Zionism. And so he was one of the first ones to propose that the Jewish people were entitled to possess the Holy Land, which is interesting because now he is in a relationship with Hugh of Champagne, who was responsible for the founding of the Templars, who of course were established in Jerusalem. But there's also a very interesting story about Rashi meeting with Godfrey of Bouillon before he goes on the crusade. And I can't remember what prediction was, but I can't remember the details of the story, but it just shows that Rashi was very much in a very close relationship. He was also connected to people like I think what was his name, Harding. He's one of the founders of the Cistercian order with Saint Bernard of Clairvaux. So this is why it's interesting. Now you have this early proto-Zionist in relationship with the founder of the Templars and the Cistercian order, and so it's really from these families, because it's the families that survived the Crusade. So what's important too is that the first thing that they did is they established a kingdom of Jerusalem. And the reason for that, of course, is that it's significant for the expectations of the end times, right? Because the belief is that the Messiah will be a descendant of David. So that Messiah is supposed to have a Davidic dynasty, and so all these families could claim Davidic lineage through Guillaume of Boulogne.
Right, and the Jews are still waiting for the Messiah, right? That's one of the huge differences. They're still praying for the Messiah. Yes. 3 times a day, bring us the Messiah, bring us the Messiah.
So all these families now, basically, you get this confluence of all of the various branches of them, and almost in every case, they can all be traced back to Guillaume of Boulogne, usually claim Davidic descent, usually attempt to claim in one way or the other the right to as kings of Jerusalem. This is why I have a chapter in my latest book called The Kings of Jerusalem, because it shows how all these families evolved and intermarried, and which
right. And they look the same. If you look at pictures of the Tsarists and like the English bloodline, they look like they're definitely cousins, but they look very similar, at least back before World War I.
Yeah.
And I think that the house of was it Saxe-Coburg-Gotha, they claimed descendants through David as well. So they believe they're a bloodline through Irish kingship.
Yeah.
And that throne that they have, whatever that stone supposedly came from Jerusalem, the whatever Scottish. Yeah. So
exactly.
This stuff is real. It sounds like it's mythology. It's not. These are real stories, of bloodlines, people's going way back. It's really incredible.
I mean, there's elements that are true. There's probably a lot of elements that are embellished. But I think what's important to understand, I mean, what substantiates the claim that it's at least perceived to be true is that it forms the basis of. So I believe the order that's probably one of the most important. One of them is the Order of the Garter, but the other one is the Order of the Golden Fleece. So what's interesting is that the recent Grand Master of the Order of Golden Fleece, hereditary Grand Master, would have been Otto von Habsburg. Right? And he was another hereditary claimant of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. And this is what you find consistent going all the way back to the Crusades, is these families were typically and so what's interesting is my chapter on the kings of Jerusalem that traces their descent and their involvement in all the families that they divided into at one point is mostly Italian families, like the families of Savoy, the families of Este, the families of Sforza. They're involved in development of the tarot, which is very interesting because that's key to later occult mythology, particularly with the Golden Dawn, and the Order of the Fleur de Lis. So the Order of Fleur de Lis again is a key order closely related to Order of the Golden Fleece. And so, because when you look at the list of the Grand Masters of the so-called Prior of Zion, it's effectively a list of the Grand Masters of the Order of the Fleur de Lis and the Order of the Golden Fleece.
Wow.
So the people who are creating this modern mythology of the Priory of Zion, they had merely been introduced to the lore of these orders, and then somehow fabricated this. I think it was basically some kind of marketing campaign, because effectively that's what Dan Brown, I don't know if he knew if he was in on it or he is just a dupe, but in one way or the other, he was used to basically popularize
right
this this sort of older tradition of these orders in a particular way, because the whole focus of his book is like his favorite word, of course, words is the sacred feminine, right? That's what he claims that he's celebrating, and
you can interpret that in multiple ways, right? Like, oh yeah, that's Virgin Mary, or that's the feminine side that has sex in the old temple
That's
with
what.
the god or whatever, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah, so there's a lot of he did a good job, because I think Angel and Demons too covers the Illuminati, so he's putting those ideas into the public mind, no question.
Exactly.
And occultism,
Yeah.
pyramids, all that stuff. There's a little inside stuff there, and they talk about the Sinclairs. You talk about the Sinclairs in this book, and that they end up the movie ends up at that famous church, right,
Chapel.
in Scotland.
Rosslyn Chapel, which then ties it all together again, right? The Scots claimed descent from the Khazars, which supposedly was where they got their red hair. So Dan Brown says that Rosslyn actually means rose line or red line. So it's basically the line of this red heritage. Mary Magdalene had red hair. And so that's that
It's
entire
incredible. And then in Washington, D.C., Roslyn's right there. It's literally, you can stand in Roslyn and look straight down the, what is it called? The obelisk and everything. You can just right from Roslyn. It's really incredible. I used to live in Roslyn. There's tons of occultism in DC. So you can see you've laid the groundwork of all that stuff back to the present day, dispersed all the way. These families, these cities. I mean, you can see it in Rome, DC, London. All this stuff is in there. It's really incredible.
Yeah.
And all came back from that Templars. The Templars brought the whole idea of Baphomet, right? They brought a lot of that old black magic type stuff, is the rumor, including probably some other people too.
Yeah.
Wow, it's really incredible. I mean, it brings it up to the present. So then you have these Illuminati families, and there's a lot of, fake terrorism and fake stuff going on. We talked in the pre-show.
Yeah.
I'm not sure anything that happened from 2000 to 2008 was authentic. I don't think, I'm not kidding either. I think it was all just psychic driving and new form of warfare. Just hit dupes and suckers.
There's a great line in 1984 where Winston is talking to his girlfriend. I can't remember what her name was. And, she's not as educated as he is. That's the way he describes her. She just kind of talks, from her heart, off the cuff. And they talked about some of the terrorist attacks that happened recently. She said, "Oh, those didn't really happen. That's just the government, murdering their own people for propaganda's sake."
Wow, it's incredible.
Mm-hmm.
But you can see the environment that that Orwell wrote about was creating that environment in 1984 of bombings and shootings and chaos, and that's what's happening today.
Yeah,
same thing on TV.
Well, what's interesting about, Orwell was a student of Aldous Huxley, and so what people forget is that they focus on the aspect of him supposedly exposing tyranny, but he's basically relating what's called a Freudo-Marxist agenda. It's the belief. So the Frankfurt School, their whole purpose, of course, they have a Sabbatian background. So their whole purpose is to basically teach the holiness of sin. So, a Freudian interpretation that sin is actually natural and that it's society that forces us to suppress our instincts. And so this is why Orwell's book suggests that the totalitarian state is, suppressing what they call sex crimes. And so that the path towards, the liberation of the proletariat is also to liberate sexual amours.
Interesting. Really, in the Frankfurt School, you can blame the kind of rise of Eros to the Frankfurt School in a very general sense. They really wanted to flood Marcuse and Adorno. I don't know if Marcuse was a Frankfurt guy, but definitely Adorno. They definitely wanted to flood the post-World War II world with Eros. I think they've really succeeded.
Yeah, of course. Marcuse is the father, the guru of the new left, as they call him, and he's the one who coined "Make Love, Not War." This is why the whole entire 60s was very much, in league with the CIA's MK Ultra. It was very much a Sabbatian agenda to preach the holiness of sin. I have a whole chapter now in my latest book about the Frankfurt School and their relationship with there's I can't remember what his first name is, Wasserstrom. He's written some amazing articles about the relation of Sabbatianism with the Frankfurt School, and he shows how it's Gershom Scholem, who's the father of the modern study of Kabbalah, who introduced the concept of the holiness of sin as developed by Shabbatai Zvi to the various scholars of the Frankfurt School and how they adopted this idea.
Wow, it's incredible. And they were all like atheists. I mean, they weren't really the Jews.
They weren't
who were
atheists.
practicing conservative Jews, right?
That's it.
They were ethnically Jewish,
Right.
yeah.
Because that's the thing we have to remember about Kabbalah. It's that it's in the Sabbatian tradition. They're Jews who don't follow Judaism, right? They're Jews who identify ethnically with being Jewish, but they don't follow. They only follow. They follow Bible prophecy, but they don't follow Bible rulings.
Right.
They don't follow Bible laws.
The 613 rules, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
So that's how you can understand Zionism. That's basically a nationalist movement which claims to be Jewish and is attempting to fulfill Bible prophecy, but there's no practice of traditional Judaism associated with it.
Right. It's incredible. So the really conservative Jews, they're definitely trying to be true to the Tanakh, but then there's another group within Judaism that's doing something else. They're not quite loyalists.
That's why it's really important to look at this. Is why Rabbi Altelman is really, for me, he's the one who really exposed the whole story by showing how it's the Sabbatians who developed the traditions of both Reform and conservative Judaism to basically hijack the religion away from the Orthodox Jews. Because before that, Judaism was a religion, and then with these movements, they basically created sort of sects or like denominations, I guess they are in sort of language, and with effectively the assistance of Rothschild money, they were ultimately able to almost take control of they moved away from being a marginal movements to really being perceived as really, almost at the heart of the Jewish community today.
It's really fascinating. And there's always been a tension within the Jewish community between those Orthodox types and then these other ones. Like in Israel, the Orthodox will spit on some of these other Jews who aren't true, and they view them as real heretics. In a lot of ways, they really are heretics to the Jewish, the rules and the rules-based order of the Jewish religion. They are heretics, I would say. Oh man, it's really amazing. There's just so TDR asks you a question. Would Mr. Livingstone please share what teaching doctrines are warning signs of mystery school, Luciferianism, Satanism, Kabbalism?
What are warning signs?
I think that's what he said. Let me reread that. Would Mr. Livingstone please share what teaching doctrines are warning signs of mystery school, Luciferianism, Satanism, Kabbalism? Is that the answer to that?
I don't know. The only thing that comes to my head is I'd recommend studying what's called accelerationism today. Again, this is why I say the LaVey's Church of Satan really threw everybody off track. If they're the funny thing is, no, that Church of Satan does have a role in it. What's particularly interesting is what I cover in my latest book is the history of particularly the group of the cult in California, right? So you have people like is it Robert Evans, who was the producer?
Yes.
He produced many famous movies, but he also produced Rosemary's Baby. He happens to be a friend of Henry Kissinger. He was also a friend. Kissinger has a lot of satanic friends, which is very interesting. So he was also a friend of I can't remember his name now, who was identified by Maury Terry as one of the leaders of the
Roy Radin. Roy Radin,
thank you. Exactly, Roy Radin. And so, of course, the Process Church is really what connects Charles Manson and Rosemary's Baby and Mamas and the Papas and, that whole Laurel Canyon network. And they all followed, like Charles Manson did, this concept of accelerationism, which is the belief that you have to try to accelerate the coming of the end times. And this is the concept that they got from the Process Church. And so this concept has survived into recent times. So when we were talking about terrorism, that's why we tend to see less Islamic terrorism, but we're seeing a rise in fascist terrorism and or neo-Nazi terrorism. Because really what I've been exposing in my last few books is the survival of fascism in the 20th century. and the Fascist International. And that's really, if you want to understand, if you want to call them Illuminati or wherever they are, that's where you can find them. They just have to trace, the organizations that they belong to. In fact, so the umbrella organization of the Fascist International is a group called the Circle, and it was founded by one of the founders of it was Otto von Habsburg. Right.
And that's actually featured in an intro to one of the James Bond movies. So Ian Fleming knew about the Cirque. It was a post-World War II fascist organization.
Right.
All these type of families, right? The bloodline type.
So exactly. So
probably Fleming was probably one too.
Well, yeah, you can assume he was let in on something.
Yeah, Scottish banking family. That was.
He based a lot of his character on John Dee, of course, too. So that's.
Yeah, he knew he was in the know. Eton, he was actually around there those times.
Yeah.
Yeah, great talk. Another question we steals Plato Snakes ask. I got a question. Can David explain the descendants of Cain? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's a tough one. So descendants of Cain. Well, I mean, the entire occult history, particularly the myth of the Aryan race, because that's really the Kabbalistic fascist theology. Their outlook on their role is based on the Aryan race. And so that's the belief based on, it's basically a Kabbalistic legend that claims that it goes back to the story of the sons of God. And again, you'll find this revealed by the Ancient Alien series, which have exposed themselves as being Satanists as well. And it's the belief that at the time of the flood described in the Bible, it says that the sons of God descended to earth and intermarried with the descendants, the females. It doesn't say I don't think it says the descendants of Cain specifically. But basically, the details of the story is only exposed in what's called the Book of Enoch, which emerged in the first centuries A.D. And so the Book of Enoch explains that the sons of God were actually Lucifer and the fallen angels, and that they interbred with the descendants of Cain, and they taught them magic. So now that we have we know that the history of Kabbalah can actually be traced to the 6th century BC, but in terms of the legend that is taught, it's traced back to its claim that it descends all the way back to the sons of God of Genesis. And this is why that story, the claim is that, this is why in the 18th century, when the British began to colonize India and they were exposed to Sanskrit, and this is when they started to incorporate elements of Indian tradition. And this is why it goes back to what we talked about earlier. It's important to remember that there was a Greek tradition in India, right? So when they're looking at a shared heritage, you have to understand that part of that heritage, there's a Greek contribution to it, because this is where you get the development of this concept called the Oriental Kabbalah, which is the idea that the Kabbalah began in Tibet or Asia before it was adopted by the Jews. And so the claim is that the story of the flood represents Atlantis, and when Atlantis sank, a number of the descendants of the fallen angels, who from then on were referred to as Aryans, traveled and landed in the mountains of Asia, and that's where they spread their ancient teachings. And this is why supposedly Tibetan Buddhism represents a survival of the ancient magical teaching of Aryans, which is represented by the survival of the swastika in various parts of the world. So they settled in India, they settled in Persia, and they settled in Europe. And this is where supposedly you have the origins of the so-called Aryan race. And that's fundamentally the Kabbalistic legend that fuels the neo-Nazi, the great replacement theories and all this nonsense that's being spread now.
Right. And Iran is like the root word is based on Aryan.
Yes.
And one of Crowley's one of his main followers, Gerald York, actually brought the Tibetan Buddhist Chalakot, I can't pronounce it, Kalachakra or something, which is really esoteric Buddhism from Tibet back to the West. He was
Exactly.
doing all kinds of Iyengar yoga. So all this stuff, this wisdom has this very old,
Yeah.
you know.
And to tie into where we're going, because we wanted to talk about the terrorism Illuminati, this might be a good way to sum it all up.
Okay, cool.
Is that so that concept was brought in by Blavatsky. Helena Blavatsky is really the first one to bring forward this idea of Tibetan Buddhism in particular being the ancient heritage of the Aryan people. And this, of course, led subsequent people like Gerald York and so on to continue to advance these kinds of ideas. So Blavatsky, she claimed to have been in contact with these various ascended masters, and there's several of them. And there's a book by a couple of books by K. Paul Johnson, which is really fascinating. And he shows that one of her ascended masters was Jamal ad-Din al-Afghani. And this guy is a fascinating character. It's hard to give full weight to this guy's influence. He was a Shia born in Iran, but after he traveled to Afghanistan, he claimed to be a Sunni. When he moved to Egypt, he was kicked out of every place he came to because he was such a rabble-rouser. When he came to Egypt, he became Grand Master of the Freemasons. And he called himself, he and his followers called themselves Brethren of Sincerity. And the Brethren of Sincerity was an occult Islamic Sufi organization that, according to Masonic heritage, were the group that taught the Templars their occult doctrines. And so at the same time, so Afghani, he's basically part of a circle of all these sort of Middle Eastern Masons, all the British agents, the key British agents that gave rise to the basically, this is the focus of my book, The Terrorism Illuminati, is the particularly first of all out of Saudi Arabia, and then in the development of the Salafi movement. So Jamal Afghani is the founder of the Salafi movement, and so modern Islamic terrorism has all been really perpetrated by the Salafi movement, who eventually became allied with the Wahhabi movement. They're misperceived as being an Islamic movement. They even misrepresent themselves as being Sunni. They are not Sunni. They're really a sect that is very far away from the traditional Islam, but they were founded by Masons, and basically since that time they have been serving as tools of British imperialism and American imperialism, particularly through the founding of the Muslim Brotherhood. So the Muslim Brotherhood, again, founded by Hassan al-Banna, who apparently originally, according to John Loftus, he was commissioned by Hitler to found the group, and it was a Salafi, again, organization. The teacher of his teacher was Jamal Afghani, and so this is what's really important. So you have this one character, Jamal Afghani, who becomes one of the key contributors to this concept of the Oriental Kabbalah with Blavatsky, founder of Salafism, which is the core organization. Like Al Qaeda basically is a descendant of the Salafi tradition coming from the Muslim Brotherhood, which is basically a crypto pagan mystical organization. And secondly, we'd have a couple of minutes. Jamal Afghani was also the source for Saint Yves d'Alvedre, and he is the founder of Synarchism. So the Priory of Zion myth and all Pierre Plantard and that whole tradition, what was eventually popularized by Dan Brown, is effectively a synarchist mythology that's connected to Otto von Habsburg and the Order of Golden Fleece. They're the ones who sort of brought in and claimed this, invented this heritage of the Order of the Fleur de Lis and the Golden Fleece. So Saint Yves d'Alvedre, so it originates in the synarchism founded by Saint Yves d'Alvedre, whose original source was again Jamal Afghani.
Afghani, right? And Afghani is a kind of a notorious figure in that tradition and within Islam. Everybody knows Afghani. He was a kind of a pan-Arabist, pan-Islamist.
Yeah,
but a little not orthodox, right? So a little bit different.
Yeah,
interesting character. I remember reading about him in college, but
yeah,
and a lot of people. A lot of people don't know the esotericism and kind of the influence of Masonry within that world, within the Middle Eastern world as well. You just kind of see it from the Western perspective or the American perspective, just a bunch of people, followers of Islam and ethnic Arabs. It's not true. It's much
you have the double-headed eagle in the symbol of the of the Scottish Rite Freemasonry. That's why if you look at the typical, it's Ordo ab Cow, and it's got a double-headed eagle because that represents the East and the West. So it's the Eastern tradition and the Western tradition. The Eastern tradition typically refers to like the Brethren of Sincerity, those Middle Eastern occult organizations that the Templars came in contact with, and the Templars would represent the Eastern tradition. So they're called in Masonic tradition, they're referred to as the Emperors of East and West.
Wow, fascinating. I mean, this is a great talk. Every time I talk to you, I learn so much. Where's the best place for people to get Terrorism and the Illuminati?
Probably my latest website. So actually, it's not available anymore.
Okay, it's not available. People say the book is now $50, so like the hardbound book. Do you sell it through your website? I guess the Order of KO.
Just Google for a PDF.
Gotca. So the PDF is out there.
Around
you can definitely get a Kindle. And then your newest book is orderofko.ca. .ca, right? So or I can put that in the show. It's Order of KO, and people can order the 6-part books from that website, correct?
Yes.
And also, that's the best place to contact you if they have any follow-up questions or anything like that.
Yeah, I got everything there. I'll have this interview posted there in a couple of days. The interview page with the past interviews are linked there as well too, and links to my books. My entire book is online as well too, and other resources. I've got a chart which I finally put together, a genealogical chart of I call it the occult octopus, which shows basically the lineage of all of the key occultists and orders going back, I believe, to at least the Rosicrucians.
Wow. Yeah, I'd like to see that for sure. Thanks so much for your time. David Livingstone, title of the book, published 2007. Very important book, Terrorism and the Illuminati, a 3,000-year history by David Livingstone again. Thanks so much for your time. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Take care.
Yeah.
Stay there.